Okay, hi everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar, which is called Improving Assessment and Feedback Through Digital Tools. Can we, should we, and how do we even? So full disclosure, I might have been feeling just a little bit cynical about this whole process when I decided on that title. It's a really big area to try to cover, but don't worry, I'm feeling a lot more positive about it now, and I think the discussion we're going to have today is going to be really useful and really valuable for everyone who's joining us today. So just a little bit of background before we start. The idea for this webinar, and also for the series of podcasts that the assessment team here at the University of Birmingham are running, it actually came from some conversations that I had with Marika and Nikki, who are panelists here today, earlier this year. So Birmingham were looking into different digital assessment tools to trial at scale, and it was just getting really difficult to know what that might look like. And the higher education sector, as I'm sure everyone here knows, is full of really great advice and guidance on this topic. It's a really important topic that everyone's talking about. And the vendors themselves, of course, are very quick to tell us what they can do for us. But what I found was those conversations with Marika and Nikki were so useful. They were people who were implementing digital tools and had really thought about what this looks like on a practical level. And so because I found those conversations so useful, I thought it was only fair to open the conversation up to more people. And so while we'll talk about different tools today, this isn't a sales pitch at all, of course. None of us are from any of these platforms. But it's also not about disparaging any providers. I think, you know, we're all coming to this knowing that no one size fits all, that what works for one institution or one discipline might not work for another. That said, there are definitely lessons that we can learn from each other and from each other's experience. And that's really what today is all about. So just a reminder before we start as well that the views expressed in this webinar are the views of the panelists themselves. They're by no means representative of the views of their institutions as a whole, unless that's expressly stated. So a little bit of information about how the session will run today. So please do use the chat to introduce yourselves. I can see a lot of you are doing that already, and that's really great. Thank you. And if you want to give us a little bit about your experience of using digital assessment tools as well, that would be really interesting. We've set the poll up, so hopefully you've all seen that, and we'll be looking at those results before we come to the Q&A section at the end, just to give us an idea of who's in the audience here and your experiences. My colleagues from the assessment team here in Birmingham, Gemma Westwood and Helen Greetham, are on the call as well, and they're going to be facilitating that chat. So today we are lucky enough to have 4 panelists joining us from different universities across the UK, and we'll be having a discussion about their experiences in the 4 phases of digital assessment tools that we've identified here at Birmingham as a way that we're thinking about this process. So the first phase is requirements and governance. Second phase is onboarding, so that's staff and students. Third phase is evaluations. And then the 4th phase is the ever important next steps. We'll then have time for the Q&A at the end. So if you have a specific question for one or more of the panelists, please do use the Q&A function to ask that. And please do like each other's questions as well, because that will just help us prioritize those at the end. So I'd like to start by introducing our panel, who have very generously agreed to join us today. So going in alphabetical order, Marika Guy is the head of digital assessment at University College London, where she leads a team of digital assessment advisors and learning technologists. Professor Nikki Hai is lecturer in microbiology and director of education in the School of Biological Sciences at the University of Manchester. Dr. Linda Lefebvre is an associate professor in endocrinology and the Deputy Director of Education for Digital and Distance Learning, as well as continuous professional development lead for the College of Medical and Dental Sciences here at the University of Birmingham. Dr. John Tandy is lecturer in analytical chemistry at the University of Kent and has a keen interest in innovative assessment strategies and tools, particularly for use within chemistry and forensic science. And I'm Alison Gibson. I'm one of the heads of HEFI Digital, and I'm leading the assessment team here at the University of Birmingham. So thank you everyone for joining us today. I think this is going to be a really interesting discussion. So I think we'll just get straight into the questions now. I think everyone's probably joined and is ready to go. So if we start with phase one, so this is thinking about requirements gathering. And Marika, I might come to you if that's okay. So could you tell us what the biggest challenge with assessment and feedback you were facing at UCL and that you were hoping a digital assessment tool would be able to address?
Yeah, no, certainly can. Hi, everyone. So I've actually been involved in quite a lot of different procurement projects around assessment. I've worked at quite a few institutions. So when I was at the University College of Estate Management, our biggest driver there around assessment procurement was around quality assurance processes, around the assessment design. So that was involving the academic authors, external examiners, but we were also looking at diversity of assessments in a fully online institution. So that was a big one. Thinking things like video assessment, we started looking at. Diversity was a big problem also when I was at the Royal Agricultural University, where we went through an e-portfolio procurement process. And then here at UCL, our existing platform has been procured during COVID. So it's very much in response to how can you run previously in-person exams in a remote and online way. There was also quite a lot of focus on improving some of the admin processes there. So integration with our existing student record system. At UCL, we're now involved in a sort of future of assessment piece of work where we're trying to understand other issues, more particularly around NSS and diversity of assessments and looking at things like feedback. So we're looking at tools in that space. So lots of different challenges at different institutions, really, which feeds into the procurement process.
Yeah, tricky question, but were you able to find one that could integrate with your student record system? Because that sounds amazing.
Yeah, we have done that at UCL. That's a big piece of work, actually, making sure that our SITS works well with our assessment system, and it's been really effective, very effective from the administrative side.
Absolutely, that sounds amazing. Thank you, Marika. Nikki, what about you? I know obviously you're working on a program in Manchester. What was the biggest challenge that you had?
I mean, I guess for us, like, you know, we're always, it's like the holy grail of improving your assessment and feedback. And it's something what we were really trying to work on and trying to find a platform that was more supportive for students when they were doing their assessment. So the kind of VLE that we were originally using is kind of really was clunky, and our kind of analysis showed that students really weren't using the supportive documents that we were providing to help them with their assessments. So we were kind of hoping to produce something or to find another platform that was more supportive, gave more kind of advice and guidance at every stage. So that was one element. And also for exams as well, running exams online was a big thing for us. You know, during COVID, we switched to online exams, but they were online open book. But we are looking for an exam platform that was more kind of secure, more AI proof. And so, you know, we were kind of looking in a direction of other platforms that might be able to help us with that, with securing that.
I mean, for those digital exams, are you thinking mainly on campus, or are you hoping to keep running exams, but for students?
Well, I mean, this year we're running exams remotely or online remotely, but the idea would be that we would maybe run them on campus as a kind of online exam, bring your own device type things. But that's a kind of thing that's happening at the moment, and yeah, that's kind of what we'd like to see: more invigilation, more AI proof exams.
Yeah, so it feels like the requirements kind of fall broadly into two categories, I suppose, from what you're describing there. They're kind of technical side. What do we need that our VLE just can't do? So things like digital exams, and then the more maybe the innovation of it, the student support and improving that assessment journey. Does that sound fair? Kind of.
No, I think you summed it up really well, Alison, far better than I did, probably.
Yeah. I think it's improving the pedagogy, but also improving the processes or smarter ways of working. And I think the trick is to get the balance between the two. What you don't want to do is improve in one side, but make detriment in the other, really. So I think you've hit the nail on the head.
Yeah, and I'm sure this will come up later as well, but obviously the VLEs can do so much around assessment, but are we having to change our assessments to fit into that, or can digital tools provide a wider scope for what we can offer? Thank you both. That's really interesting. So if we think a little bit around phase 2 and onboarding staff and students. So I guess at this point we're thinking we've had our requirements, and we've chosen one or more digital tools, and how do we actually get that get staff and students as excited about using it as we all are, of course. So Linda, if I can come to you first for this one, how did you engage staff and students when you were bringing in new digital assessment tools?
Yeah, thank you, Alison. Well, if we start with staff, and I have different experience, so I'm going to contrast having an online platform that's been chosen locally. So the program have decided that that's the platform they want, and in the example of this one is because they already use Question Bank from that same online assessment, and therefore they felt that fitted better. And because a decision was made at the level of the program, the buy-in from the staff, it was what they were offering, and therefore everybody sort of engaged very well with it, compared to the other side of a pilot that we piloted for an institutional pilot, and we were trying to engage some programs that, because of the requirement that they needed, we're trying to say, well, this platform could be useful for you. But because it didn't come from them, we had a little bit more pushback, and it was a little bit harder to get them engaged. But in any case, what we've done for all of them is that we provided some training about how to use the different platforms. We've written some guidance, video guidance, written guidance. We provided some drop-in sessions. We provided some one-to-one support. And for the pilot, we then had a questionnaire, because we just need to know how things were going. So I think we've done the same thing, but the buy-in was very different because some use the BLE, and even though they complain, it was just a bit difficult to still engage them to use something different. For the students, the ones who already decided that that's the online platform, that was easy, because the students didn't know any different. They didn't use a VLE before, so they just, they had written guidance again. We made sure that they had some formative assessment prior to use it as an exam. That really helped them. For the other ones, we just had to make sure of the pilot, because they already use other platforms, it was giving them an additional platform. And to avoid frustration, we had to communicate why we were using the platform, again, give them some feedback, make sure we had a formative assessment prior any online platforms, and then again get the questionnaire and feedback, because it was a pilot.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think sometimes when we talk about students' engagement, we have a tendency to overthink. Sometimes I'm not sure whether students know what they're using or particularly care. They just want to do their assessment and do it well. But at the same time, it's so important for us to know what their experiences are, just in case there is anything that they're flagging. So
they're much more flexible. They're much more flexible than the academics, because they don't have to do all the hard work in the background.
Yeah, students have it easy, don't they? And John, what about you? How did you go about engaging staff and students?
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously not really my particular role to engage other staff, but in terms of the pilot I was involved in recently, I think there was quite a lot of initial enthusiasm for seeing some of the benefits of that particular tool. But actually, when it got kind of to the nitty-gritty of it, it was much more difficult to engage the staff in terms of, just because of workloads, as we know, are very tight at the moment. So you really do need to kind of demonstrate benefits very clearly. I think when you're doing those, and as Linda said, things like, we had like demonstrations where we could clearly see the benefit and the way in which the tool would work. So staff, I think, can latch onto that a bit more easily sometimes if they can see that clear link with their current practice. So I think that's really important, again, in terms of also having kind of help sheets. And when you're using tools, I think can be really useful for staff, so they don't feel a bit isolated sometimes when they're trying to engage with that when they're writing their assessments. And I guess maybe it's also pointing out that the benefits can be very different for particular staff members. Some may really be focused on getting an enhanced assessment in terms of pedagogy or whatever it is, whereas others may be more focused on the amount of time they can save or you know, other aspects that might be more important to them. And in terms of students, I think what was already been said is absolutely right. They are much more flexible generally. I think it's nice to be upfront with them and to say, if you are trying something new, we are trying something new, and these are the reasons that we are doing that. And I think students generally will engage with that well. And I think in terms of, it's also can be quite preferable if you're using a new tool to maybe do that initially in a kind of low stakes environment. So perhaps using it in a formative assessment rather than a summative straight away. And of course, there's a learning process involved with using a new tool. And so then, of course, you can then maybe embed it later on in their course for something that's a bit higher stakes, or maybe in something like a workshop or something like that. I think we've used tools previously where maybe they've used kind of a particular type of interface in the kind of lower years for something low stakes, and maybe a slightly more simple assessment, and then you can kind of ramp it up, and so they get more familiar, they get more confident being able to use that interface. So I think that can help with some of the anxiety that sometimes students can face with using a new tool, particularly if they're not. We have obviously a wide variety of abilities in terms of how tech savvy some students are, and maybe some aren't. So I think, yeah, some do maybe are a bit more anxious or preoccupied with the kind of having to use those tools for the first time. So maybe, yeah, some of those kind of methods can help with that.
If I could add to John, absolutely. I invigilated exams, and students, it's harder than to just take a piece of paper, you know, an online platform, and they forget their login details, and it could create a lot of anxiety for both academics and students. But interestingly, if you say to them, look, you can't log in, here's a piece of paper, they don't want to use the paper anymore, because there's so much more flexibility on the online. They could edit, they could move things along, they could type. Well, not everybody types faster, but you know, they don't stop typing. So when you give them a piece of paper, they just don't want to go back to it. But it does create other issues as well, which leads to anxiety as they're sort of about to come into their exams.
I think that's really interesting. I think we often talk about the importance of giving students the opportunity, as you've both mentioned, to use the tools in a formative way before they do a summative assessment, because of that anxiety. But I think it might just be worth mentioning as well, that's really useful for the staff to have that kind of trial run and not go straight into a high stakes assessment with a tool that they're just getting to know as well. I think it's also interesting, you were both talking a lot about benefits there and using the benefits of a tool to increase the buy-in of staff. I was just wondering how you feel about speaking about the limitations of a tool as well. Like, you know, we all know that the different tools have different limitations. And is there a place for us to bring that into the conversations as well, that kind of honesty, I suppose?
Yeah, I mean, from my perspective, I think it's really important, particularly if you do have other staff that have used tools before, speaking to them about what works well and maybe what doesn't work so well. And there is, as you said at the beginning, there's always going to be some limitations with the particular tool. And it is very discipline specific as well. And I think if we can have more cross communication within institutions and also across institutions, with which tools are appropriate for which type of assessment, the type of questions we're asking, the different disciplines, I think that's all really valuable.
Yeah, if I could just add, I know we're moving toward, and we're going to have a discussion about that, our change of assessment and to rethink about our questions. But I think we need to be flexible when we're using the online platform. We need to be flexible as academics. It's not about, using our assessment, our old assessment, and trying to force them into the system. That has created a lot of work for us in Birmingham. And the support has been amazing, but it's not the greatest thing. You're much better. So there's so much things we can do with the online platform. It's about tweaking instead of trying to force and making it frustration and difficult for everybody. So that would be a good tip for me. We're all nodding, so.
No, absolutely. So if we think a little bit about phase 3, so I've got this down as evaluation. So the idea that, okay, we've had our requirements, we've chosen the tool, we've onboarded staff and students, people have experience of this now, they've done some assessments, and thinking a little bit about what that evaluation might look like and also the kinds of insights that it could provide. So John, if I could just come back to you on that one and the types of evaluations that you've run.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, perhaps the easiest example is the recent pilot I did. So this, again, I used a kind of a low stakes environment for this. This is a formative assessment, trialing this AI assisted digital tool with the purpose of trying to use that to kind of predict the feedback that you would typically put on scripts, with the purpose of trying to save marking time in particular, and also providing consistent feedback for all students. So I had 3 workshops where we had about 20 to 25 students in each workshop. And one of the advantages of doing it in a workshop setting was, of course, that I could provide in-person support throughout that time, which was really valuable when they were using that tool for the first time, if they did have any kind of specific issues related to using the interface and how to engage with that. So one of the things I did when implementing that was I tried to use a variety of question types to kind of test out the system, if you see. So, for example, I'd had some questions that just purely required a mathematical, numerical answer. Some were a bit more descriptive, and then some actually required them to actually write formulae. And so that was all kind of, in theory, within the limits of the actual tool that I was trialing, but I wanted to see how well that would work. And another interesting thing was the way in which the students would interface with that tool. And one of the nice things about this particular tool was it gave students some choice in terms of how they would actually input their answers. So they could actually type, traditional typing in with the answers. They could actually use a kind of stylus to actually write, and then the tool would interpret that and then digitize it. And then they also had the ability to upload images. So in theory, of course, they could hand write and then upload that. So that was another thing I was really curious to see. And it was very interesting that actually across the different workshops, there was quite a variety in terms of the way in which students interacted. I was quite surprised actually that all 3 of those methods were used. And it was interesting to see, of course, how well then the tool interpreted into that. So that was another learning kind of point for me in terms of when I then came to do the actual marking. What I was then required to do is maybe a little bit of additional work in terms of interpreting what they'd written and was that actually correct. So it was kind of interesting to see the kind of time aspect related to that as well. I think one of the things that I've reflected on as well was that a lot of traditional students can force traditional assessments can force students to work in a particular way. So if we can add aspects of choice using these digital tools, I think that can really benefit students potentially. But we do have to design the assessment in a way that's going to use that to its best ability. So there is a somewhat of a trade-off there. And again, maybe finally, another insight maybe that I'd bring was there was a bit of a kind of chicken and an egg dilemma that I had with this, in the sense that actually designing that assessment, I needed to know something about which way the tool would actually operate in terms of how it would interpret the answers that the students gave, so I could design my questions in a way that would best use that. Now, of course, trialing it, I didn't know all of that until I'd actually gone through that process. So it's almost like you need to go through a proper trial before you actually learn how best to use the tool. So I think that, and that's I think probably a constant struggle for lots of different tools. So yeah, it was an interesting reflection, particularly for this latest tool that I'd used. And so if staff can invest time in terms of trialing it and testing it on low stakes, maybe small student numbers first, that can really help to inform future assessments.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point, and certainly something that's turned up in our evaluations over the years of different tools. It was a really hard semester, but I've now got the hang of it. And if I get to do it again, it won't be quite so hard. And obviously that's a tricky thing to then evaluate, because it's how long do you let that go on for? It's a steep learning curve always at the beginning of using these different digital tools. Nikki, can I come to you on that question too, about your evaluations that you've run?
Yeah, so I mean, our evaluation was really more about, kind of what we learned from using these tools in our assessment processes. And I think the one thing we learned a lot about is how students go about generating work for their assessment, how long they take particularly. We set an assignment, a 1,000-word essay, maybe it's worth 20% of the mark of the unit. And, we assume it takes X number of hours to do that. But, using these tools, you can really kind of drill down and see exactly how much time students are taking. You can see how they construct their assessments, the whole kind of process of pasting it in, editing it out, deleting it. You can see all of those things. And I think the one real correlator for students is the fact that the amount of time you take to do an assessment isn't directly proportional to the mark that you get at the end of it. And so we've been able to use a lot of those insights to help students and to give them general feedback about, how they should prepare for an assessment, roughly what sort of time they should be taking based on the metrics that we got from Cadmus. We also kind of found that when you're dealing with individual students who aren't performing very well or are struggling, and you want to give them really kind of detailed feedback, perhaps in a meeting, a one-to-one meeting, you can actually kind of drill down and see exactly how they went about, writing their assessment, and maybe give them some hints and tips about how they can improve their kind of writing process. So there was that. The other thing that we found that was really useful that we hadn't really considered when we introduced the assessment was that in any assessment, whatever you're doing in university, there's always somebody who hands it in late. And they hand it in late for some random reason. Maybe the Wi-Fi went down, maybe they thought they'd submitted it at the right time, but in fact the whole process hadn't worked. And for us, if it's 1 minute late, it gets 10% knocked off the total mark, which is quite a punitive reduction in marks. But with these kind of online platforms, what was really useful is that you could go back and look at the individual student who'd submitted late, and you could actually see when they'd last finally saved their piece of work, and accept their reasons and accept that piece of work for marking, because everything was saved on the platform. It was ultimately submitted when they decided that they'd kind of ended the assessment, but you could see exactly when they saved their piece of work. And so that was really useful, and I think that saved a lot of students from losing 10% of the mark, and it also saved a lot of anxiety in that whole kind of in that whole process. We saw a big reduction in academic malpractice as well, using that assessment, because one of the things we said to the students was, this platform can see every time you cut and paste, we can detect that and we can look into it, and so that's going to really enhance our academic malpractice detection process. It's still got Turnitin embedded into it, but it gives you that additional insight as well. And also when you've got AM hearings, actually then you can kind of look at, students often don't understand why they've got academic malpractice and why they've done anything wrong. They don't really understand what they're doing, what mistakes they're making, and you can really lay it out for them by showing them exactly what they've done. And so those were kind of useful insights. I don't think there was anything really negative that we came across really that I can share with you. I mean, for us, the use of this platform was generally positive.
Hmm. Yeah, that's really interesting. When you're talking about looking at student analytics on that level, what sort of cohort size are you talking about there?
Well, for my students on my unit, it was about 180 students, but I mean, some of our units would be up to 300.
Yeah, that's a lot of students to be, and a lot of information for a lot
Oh,
of.
no, exactly. It's great. I mean, you learn things that you just had no idea about before, and I think that's really important feedback for academic staff. You know, when they're setting assessments, is that you have no idea how a student's going to perceive it and how long they're going to spend on it. So it actually does give you a bit of a heads up. You know, it's things that you never knew, and that's really important information.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, thinking about the evaluations and how it can impact on those conversations with students. I think for us, when we think about evaluating a tool and then possibly scaling it up, we're mainly thinking kind of direct support or training for academics and that kind of the logistics, I suppose, of it, rather than thinking about how the information from these tools could impact on those conversations. It's a bit around assessment literacy, I suppose, and informing those conversations that you're having.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's really important. It is really interesting. You can kind of get a profile for a student who's getting a first class mark and how they go about generating their assessment. You can compare with somebody who's further down the mark scale, and the differences are quite substantial. There's a definite pattern, I would say.
I imagine it's difficult to try and have a conversation with a student that's not, if you work less, you'll get a better mark.
Yeah, or maybe if you thought, or perhaps if you thought more before you wrote, perhaps that's perhaps that's what they really need to do often.
Yeah, that's interesting. Okay, so we're going to spend a little bit of time now thinking about phase 4. So this is the kind of next steps part of the assessment journey, I suppose. This is the part, I suppose, going back to what you were saying earlier, John, in terms of that feedback from staff saying, "Oh, now I know how to use it. So next semester, I'll be able to use it better, or my workload won't be quite so high." And trying to share some of these experiences to maybe get people a little bit ahead of the game in terms of those conversations. So Marika, if I can come to you first with this one. So can you tell us if you're still using any of these digital assessment tools? Have you scaled up their use? How that's kind of looked?
Yeah. So yes, the answer is, are we still using the tools? But I just want to take a step back. Actually, I was saying it's really interesting that the panel is made up predominantly of academics, and one of the biggest challenges we have quite often is actually engaging academics. So these are incredibly engaged academics, which is really exciting. But that's actually taking things on to the next steps and scaling up. It involves a lot more engagement with academics and working out how academics can use this as part of their practice, and sometimes moving away from that kind of lift and shift approach to the type of assessment redesign that we've sort of been touching on. So looking at very much kind of what's in it for me with regard to academics, bringing case studies, showing best practice from academic to academic. So yeah, scaling up is really tricky, especially at somewhere like UCL, where we have 11 different faculties who are all engaging very different practice. There's a huge time commitment around this. And then, as we mentioned in the intro, I'm really lucky enough to have a team of digital assessment advisors who work with the faculties. And we're trying to sort of move away from that sort of technical approach, how do you use the platform, and that administrative approach to much more kind of pedagogic exploration. So what type of challenges do you have within your teaching and learning? What learning outcomes are you trying to meet? And how can we use the tools that we have to better facilitate those type of things? So it's really key that we start having those conversations with people. I think scaling up is also, as Alison mentioned right at the beginning, not one size doesn't fit all with the platform for it, so it's very difficult. And scaling up also involves a lot more conversations around strategy and institutional plans around assessment and feedback. So senior leadership have a big role to play here. So there's lots at play. I think it's going to be very difficult for one institution to find that every single person in their in the institution, all the academics and students are using one approach or one platform. It's really going to be a much longer conversation. So I think we're on a journey, but actually using these tools, as everyone has said, they really start making you think about where you're going as an institution around your practice. So yeah.
I like the idea that we're on a journey. We're all on this.
We are. I think a lot of the assessment tools that are out there at the moment, probably virtual learning environments aside, are quite immature in this space, and things have changed a lot, mainly because of push of COVID. So I think the tools themselves are still rapidly changing, the type of things that they do and the sort of things that they support are changing. So yes, it's very much it feels like a journey to me.
Yeah, absolutely. Linda, if I can bring you in on that question as well.
Yeah, I mean, just to answer that last point, absolutely. I think there's a lot happening on the online platforms, which it's just things are moving very quickly, and therefore it's making it even harder to make a decision of what's the best platform. So to answer your question about we're still using the tool. So again, I'm going to compare the two different platforms. The one that was decided locally, and because a question bank was really important, we have kept the online assessment platform, and other programs are continuing using it. It has not gone further than that. And to be fair, the type of assessment they're using is very simplistic. So they're using lots of MCQs or multiple choice questions and short answer questions within the platform. And therefore, they felt the staff are getting used to, submit their questions. The provider responds very quickly to the requirements that we have with that platform. So the relationship is very good. The response is very good. And also in this case, is a medical program. Other medical programs across other universities are also using the same platform, which is also useful. But it has not gone, it didn't scale up because the platform is not suitable for all the requirements we have at an institutional level. For the one we did a pilot with, unfortunately, there were some major requirements that we needed. The main one was that we wanted to have everything integrated into the BLE. And we wasted a lot of time trying for that to work, and that delayed the onboarding, which then limited the pilot. So we were able to upload some of the assessment, do some formative feedback, but we never got to the level of doing a live exam. There were some features that were lacking, and very often the companies, they work with what's the requirement of most institutions, what do most people want, and then they focus on that. And we had, because we've been, for example, marking online for many years now, the other institutions didn't. Also, staff felt that to set up the questions, it was quite extra steps compared to the VLE. Even students felt that the VLE was easier to use than the new online platform. And also, we then moved into a more substantial, what do we want as an institution, and trying to gather lots of requirements from all over the different colleges, STEM, non-STEM. And it became clear that we needed more than one platform. And unfortunately, that platform didn't meet those core requirements that we needed.
I think that point around the vendor relationship and the conversations around those requirements is really interesting. It's really easy to think we'd all have really similar requirements, but it's very clear when you have these conversations and you see the face of someone who seems to think that what you're asking for is a little bit strange.
And the misunderstanding about the requirement as well. I think when you approach and you have a demo, you think, oh yeah, you can do all of that. But when you go into the nitty-gritty, like John was saying, this is where you sort of get hit by, actually, this is not what I meant, and that's not what they meant. To be fair, the relationship was great with both platforms. But obviously, if you have more people wanting something which is not what you want, it just becomes very difficult.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think there's something interesting actually just around the term scaling up and what we mean, because VLEs are used across the board, I suppose we can say. Everyone just about. I know a few examples that don't, but pretty much everyone will use the VLE. But when we're talking about scaling up assessment tools, are we actually talking about everyone using one? Or are we talking about the majority of people in the majority of disciplines, and everyone else can keep using the VLE? So I think there's some questions there as well about what we even mean by that term.
But I think if we have institutional tools and we have enough to fit everybody's need, I think that's the important thing we need to do, because in some instances the VLE does work well for, upload and marking. Well, if you want to have a bigger breadth of exam type of question and move to changing the type of assessment, then you need to think and having something like the analytics to look at what students are doing. That's really, really useful for their own feedback and for our own, and to show them how to work and get better grades.
Yeah, no, definitely. So our final question before we move on to the Q&A, if you were going to do this all again, what would you do differently? So Linda, if I can start with you, please.
I think one of the things is, I have to say, we've learned a lot from pilot or current other institutional, like the VLE, for example, or other platforms that we have. And I think it was very, very useful to have a pilot and to learn from it and to try to, avoid those traps. Talking to other institutions would be great, but sadly, because we are doing things very differently, it's very, very difficult to share good practice with an institution. And that's something that really surprised us. Test the system, because to understand the functionalities and the limitation, and don't just rely on suppliers during the procurement to say yes, this works. It's actually really looking into it. And I think the other one is actually for the willingness of the provider to ensure that those updates that we need for the new features that are our core requirements are, they provide us that on a regular basis and listen to what we need.
Yeah, definitely. John, how about you?
Yeah, I think for me, one of the really important things is kind of getting that balance right between really good personalized feedback, particularly at the kind of higher levels when you're looking into year 2, year 3 and beyond, maybe postgraduate study as well, and understanding what the tool can do to address that. So I think, of course, as you get to higher levels, particularly in our discipline, you get to more open questions. And that means that actually the tool's got to work a little bit harder often to provide that kind of quality feedback that you would like. And one thing I did find during my pilot was that even though I was providing quite consistent feedback because of the tool I was using, there were a number of instances that I read a response from a student, and I really needed to go in and provide very personalized feedback to address a really key misunderstanding that they had, because particularly within scientific disciplines, that error can then be taken forward. And because we're very progressive in terms of what we learn, we really are taking information forward from module to module. We need to address that error right there and then, so then it's not a misunderstanding that's taken forward. So it's really, again, thinking about what questions you're asking and making the tool work in that way to provide the right kind of feedback, and also making sure that it can address those very specific needs. And maybe there isn't a perfect tool to do that. I don't know.
Yeah, I think it's hard to keep up to date sometimes with all the functionality that's changing in all these tools. You can say 6 months ago they couldn't do this, and now all of a sudden they can, and it which is great. I'm not saying they should stop making those improvements, but I think as people using the tools, it can be hard to keep up to date with all of that, and to make sure, and to, if our requirements are reasonably static, how does that then fit with an industry that's changing so rapidly? Marika, how about you?
Yeah, I've got a personal one, which is if I could do another procurement project, I'd like to see it all the way through from start to finish. So either do the beginning bit or just do the end bit, but the whole thing from start to finish would be nice. I think this is very much a change management process. So one thing that I think is really key, and to just if I was going to do a new procurement project, it's really up the front of something that needs to be done. So something people might want to do differently, which is involve all stakeholders in the process. So I think quite often some of these projects will focus on one group's benefit. So it's the academic staff or the kind of the admin staff, or even the students, but without considering how it will impact on those other groups. And what ends up happening is you quite often just moving issues around. So you might be saving the admin staff, but actually you're giving the academics more things to do, and vice versa. So sort of not consulting people at the beginning can really lead to resistance later down the line. And I think the whole kind of change management process is really around understanding all of those perspectives. So having really clear communication, stakeholder engagement, and supporting all of those different people throughout the process. So that's a key one for me if I was going to run a procurement process. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that idea of change management is really interesting. The change management course that I went on once, it was really stark how about a third of the people were so excited by the idea of change, and 2/3 were just saying, no, don't make me do that. And I think, as you mentioned here with this webinar, there are a lot of academics who are really engaged and who will get on board, but there's that change management piece for everyone else as well. Nikki, what about you?
Yeah, so my situation's a little bit different from, Mariko, who's kind of procurement. So I'm an academic, and the tool that we trialed, which is Cadmus, was just literally kind of dropped onto us. And I think from my point of view, it would have been useful to see what the alternatives were. So we were never given any opportunities to discuss or evaluate other platforms. And so as an academic, it would have been useful if we could have seen that. But as it turned out, the platform that we trialed, we liked, and it suited our purposes, but that might not necessarily have been the case. So I think it really is important that, when you introduce new platforms within universities, that you survey the requirements of individual academics before you unilaterally decide which one you're going to go with. And I've got no idea what the decision process was in Manchester. I mean, it worked out okay, but it would have been nice to be involved, prior to that. And I think that's really what I would say in terms of deploying it. I kind of wish we'd been braver, because it was so new to us, and we were very tentative and very, very cautious. We're particularly concerned about how students would feel about using this platform, and because they don't use their own kind of, they're all used to using Microsoft Word, and that's how their life is set up. But when you use this platform, you use the kind of word processing package that's embedded into it. And I think we thought that they would be, really anti that, but it turned out that they weren't that particularly bothered. And in the pilots that we ran initially, the student experience was really good, and in the surveys that they completed, the scores were always really high, and people even came up to me and said that they really liked doing it. So I kind of wish we'd been a bit braver and maybe run a bigger pilot. We started off very small, and we've kind of gradually expanded out, and I wish we'd had the courage of our convictions and gone a bit bigger sooner. I think that would be how I would change things if I were to go back in time.
I like that, a call to bravery. That's a beautiful way to express that. So thank you, everyone. That's the end of the preset questions. We'll move on to the Q&A. I think what's really clear, and I can see a lot of things going on in the chat as well, that this is somewhere an area in which so many people and so many institutions are just trying so hard to make improvements, and it's really challenging to do, to be able to do that. So I think if I can ask Gemma, if you want to close the poll and we can have a quick look. So we've got about 50% of the people here are already using digital assessment tools, about 50% aren't, which is quite interesting. And the rating of the tool to meet those requirements around assessment and feedback, we have about 10% saying very good, 15% saying good, close to 20% are feeling quite neutral about this, and then a small number finding it a poor experience. So I find that interesting in itself, that such a large chunk of people are feeling kind of like, maybe it helps, maybe it doesn't. I think that's something that is worth thinking about when we're thinking about scaling up in particular, I suspect. So if we have a little bit of a look now at the Q&A question. So John, there's a question that's come in here for you. So have you ever had a problem with telling students that you're using a new tool? The person says, I think using it for low stakes is a good way to approach rather than telling them it's a new tool for a high stakes assessment.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's exactly the point. I do think we have to be open and honest with students, and we just, as I said earlier, we have to really iterate very clearly to them why we are trying this. We're not doing it just for fun, right? There's got to be try to highlight some benefits to them. You're going to get better feedback. You're going to get more consistent feedback. You're going to get more timely feedback. I mean, there's some tools actually now that provide instant feedback as they are working through, and those are very effective in areas that I've worked with. And actually, they allow students to be a bit more confident in terms of making a slight error because they get another chance. You know, they maybe don't get the full marks, but they can see where they've gone wrong. They might get a little hint to point them in that kind of direction of, oh yeah, okay, well, I know what I've done wrong now, but I can still get some credit for that. And if we can clearly highlight those advantages early on in that process, I think they're much more likely to engage. Of course, there's always going to be some pushback occasionally from some students. Some students want to, wait for want of a better word term, do the minimum, right? They won't want to engage with anything new. But I think if we can, on the whole, engage them, then I think, yeah, generally they're pretty flexible, as we said earlier.
Mm-hmm. Would anyone else like to jump in on that question? I like the way it was raised. Have you ever had a problem? Very asking about very specific students there.
Yeah.
Okay, so if we move on to the next question. So we have one from Malcolm Murray, who's asked, how do you balance, number one, the desire to provide an authentic assessment, for example, using tools that students may go on to use in future employment, with attempts to diversify assessment, and then the need to provide students with a supportive interface and tracking student activity like the one in Cadmus? So Linda, I can come to you.
I think this is what we're trying to achieve in Birmingham. You know, we want a change of assessment. We are thinking about authentic assessment. Having a range of tools allows us to try different things. And, you know, we have this proof of concept, so we trying bits and bobs and sharing good practice. And absolutely, I really like the idea of that analytics to sort of support our students. So I think we are trying to tick all those boxes, and it's, I guess it's not a balance. I think we're all trying to do it at the same time. The conversations are there. We may be not yet at the change of the authentic assessment bit, but we are talking about it and we're trying to change it. But we're trying to, try different things, trial and error, really.
I think it's interesting, the idea of using tools that students might go on to use in their future employment, because as far as I know, none of the ones that we're talking about now would be used after they graduate. I think we'd be talking about something like Teams, you know, which is something else entirely. Did anyone else want to jump in there on that question of the balance about what we're trying to do here?
I was just going to say, yeah, it's something we've wrestled with, because you're right, it's quite often the tools that we're giving them to do these activities in are not the tools they'll go on to use, but they will also work in a world where they'll need to use different tools all the time in their jobs. But I'm a big fan of using things like Excel and Word within assessments as part part of the way you create those assessments, you engage in those conversations. I think there's other tools that can be used as part of that, really like video assessments, really like using presentations and those type of things within assessment. So I think there are ways that you can bring an authentic angle in. And I think sometimes the question itself, the actual assessment question, is a way to bring in the authentic angle. You don't need to get somebody to answer an essay question in the usual manner. You can change that to be a report. You can change that to have a clear focused audience that the student's writing for. So there's lots we can do within the platforms. The tools don't have to constrict us around that thinking. I mean, something around AI that we've really tried to get the message out to people is that actually, while this does require assessment rethinking and redesign, there's a lot you can do just by tweaking some of the ways you've worded things, some of the things that you're asking your students. So I think we have to be careful about saying, you know, there's no way we can do that using this tool. It's up to us to write those really authentic assessments.
No, I think that's a really, really good point. So there's a question here saying, no, it's early days, but is there any evidence of impact on closing the awarding gap? Now, we're quite early in our evaluations here at Birmingham, so I'd say no from our point of view, but has anyone else looked into that?
Go ahead, Nikki.
No, I was going to say, I think we're the same. We're very early, so I don't think I can really comment on that.
I was going to say, online platform is a tool. I think the pedagogy and the think about the assessment and providing the feedback is what's going to bridge the gap. And the assessment platform, I believe, will help us provide better feedback. But it's just a platform, and it's just a content to pass the exam. And I think we need to think more about how to improve feedback for our students. This is a great opportunity with AI and with all the tools and the annotation and the videos and I think that would help bridge the gap and changing the way we provide feedback, which is always at the end of an assessment instead of at the start, so they could improve. And I think there's a lot of people, when I hear they talk about assessment and new platform, they don't want to change the way they do. We always did that at the end. And I think until the time we change that practice, it's going to be very difficult to close the gap.
So I just want to say digital assessments by their very nature tend to be more accessible. So there is a gap that is being bridged there. It's a bit of a shame post-COVID that actually the huge return to in-person exams is at the detriment of some of those students who've really come along leaps and bounds using online assessments of sorts. So I think that digital itself can be a real benefit. I think things around universal design for learning and type of approaches that we use there will help bridge those awarding gaps. I'd love to see some data from people on different platforms around this in the future. I think it's an area that we really should be looking at. There's a lot of potential there.
I'll just pick up maybe as something kind of related, maybe in that there are some disadvantages, of course, with certain digital tools in that they don't always provide for all students, particularly with certain learning needs. So, I mean, we have a student at Kent who has very limited eyesight, and that is incredibly challenging. And so, obviously, they have their own set of tools to be able to engage with traditional written word, whether online. But if they can't interface with that new learning tool, whether it be whatever it is, then that completely that eliminates that option for them. And so we might have to provide an alternative assessment. And so that's another consideration as well, maybe.
Yeah, and just to flag, when you go through the procurement process, accessibility is a really key area that we should be looking at and making our decisions for our future tools based on. But totally take that each student is different with different needs.
Yeah, I think it's telling. It seems like we're all at the point where the conversations are, let's make sure the digital tools don't increase the gap or don't negatively affect our students. And that's a kind of base level that I think we're all working at the moment. And then maybe it's a kind of aspirational part that we can add on in the future to how we work with these tools. I'm just very aware of the time, and so even though this has been so valuable, and I'm sure we could all just keep talking about this for a long time, I think we'd better let everyone get back to work. So I'd just like to thank everyone who's attended today. Thank you for participating in the chat. I haven't had a chance to catch up with that yet, but I'm looking forward to reading that, and also for the questions in the Q&A. It's really good to see just so much engagement on this topic. If you'd like to be kept up to date on more webinars and podcasts that we're doing, please subscribe to the mailing list, which is in the chat. Also, really big thank you to the panelists. I'd like to give you a big virtual round of applause for joining us for today and for sharing your experiences. It's so easy to feel really siloed, I think, in our institutions. And I think conversations like this just show how much we're all working in this area and how much we can all learn from each other, and just really helping to join some of those dots across the sector. So thank you so much for that. And we'll leave it there. Thanks, everyone. Have a good afternoon.